Arise News has learned of a major private sector funding commitment for the African continent backed by multinational firms to be announced at the World Economic Forum in Davos. This was disclosed by Chido Munyati, head of Africa at the World Economic Forum, as part of a wider African conversation with Arise business correspondent Rutus Odiri.
Thank you so much for speaking to Arise News. I wanted you to first tell us about the theme of this forum, about rebuilding trust within the Africa context. Is that with respect to leadership, failed leadership, and how they have to rebuild trust in citizenry?
No, thank you so much for having me. So over the last 50 years, the World Economic Forum has been convening people from diverse perspectives, including Africa, to drive inclusive dialogue across generations, geographies, etc. And at this time where we are experiencing geopolitical challenges, dialogue is even more important to build trust upon which we can drive positive outcomes for economies, for societies, and Africa, as you mentioned. So for the African perspective, trust is important because, as you can imagine, between now and 2050, 1 in 4 people in the world will be African, and 1 in 3 young people in the world will be African. And 90% of that workforce growth is going to come from our region. So the question is, how do we, with our partners, private sector and global partners, create the necessary partnerships to address sort of this opportunity to create jobs for Africa's youth?
Glad you mentioned opportunity and creating jobs, because there's so many headwinds that are facing the African continent, which falls in line with a lot of low-income countries. We had a report from the World Bank on global economic prospects that was released this month. It sounded pretty bearish, Chido, and so with respect to them saying that there will be lower growth this year, especially from low-income nations, which Africa falls into, are you in line with that bearish sentiment? What are the triggers that will get the continent out of that?
Right. Yeah. No. Some of the sentiment is worrying. Last year, 1 in 3 African countries experienced double-digit inflation. A lot of this is derivative from what was happening, whether it was COVID or Ukraine, and so there is a need to sort of make some efforts to transition out of it. I think, as you refer to, what are some of the triggers or opportunities? I think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, accelerating the implementation of this agreement is important. It's the largest free trade area in the world by landmass and number of people, potentially 1.4 billion people, a GDP of about 3.4 trillion. And this proposes significant opportunities for increased FDIs, increased competition, increased transfers of knowledge and technology, as well as diversification and scaling of economies. Obviously, this is a long-term project, but I think accelerating that implementation now will prove dividends in the coming decades.
On that, are you optimistic about the dividends we can get? Because I remember Wankele Mena, who of course Executive Secretary of the Secretariat for the AfCFTA, said if we don't get infrastructure right, then that could impede the growth prospects. Look, we're coming in from Nigeria, one of the countries where Arise News is located. We've got port issues, infrastructure problems. So can those issues around the different countries in the African nation, can those be scaled to allow the AfCFTA realize its potential?
Yeah, so this is where the private sector is important. As you alluded to, there's a $100 billion deficit for infrastructure on the continent. What we're excited about is we have an initiative called the Forum Friends of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. This is an initiative of the World Economic Forum where we're mobilizing our partners to support this implementation of this agreement. And concretely, what that means is making critical commitments to investments, as well as deepening their regional value chains in the African continent. And on tomorrow, actually, we'll be launching the first ever private sector action plan. So this is the first time I'm announcing it. First ever private sector action plan for the AfCFTA, which will include concrete commitments from companies such as Coca-Cola, DP World, Pfizer, Novartis, and many others.
Oh, great. Okay, thanks for the exclusive on that one. Well, I mean, that's on the private sector side. Wouldn't they expect a follow-through for the various governments that will be keying into this landmark private sector initiative that you've announced?
Yes, so obviously the government has to create the enabling environment for this to actually succeed. But the private sector is coming to the table and saying, listen, we're willing to develop our long-term strategies within the framework of this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And if government comes to the table, then I think there could be a positive public-private partnership going forward.
Is this a 50-50 thing, Chido? I mean, when you think about development and how much emphasis is placed on the private sector, is it 50-50 or there's more emphasis on government to create this enabling environment you've mentioned to where these private sector funds can work through?
Yeah, so I think the governments did their job by signing up to the agreement. So 53 of the 54 countries have ratified it. It's in the implementation phase, and I think now it's up to business to meet them halfway and make the necessary investments. Because unfortunately, governments don't have the budgets to make those kinds of critical investments.
Yeah.
So this is where it's important for us to encourage companies to make those investments, and it makes sense for them, right? Because trade in goods and services that's analogous to what they see in China and other big markets.
Is there a total figure for this private sector fund, or is this just to be for individually with the different companies you've mentioned putting money together?
So it's individual companies. They're not giving specific dollar investments, but they're starting to drive and implement certain projects and investments that will support the implementation of the AFCFTA agenda.
Geopolitical concerns. I just want to ask you if you're worried about that. I mean, on a global scale, you've got what's happening with Gaza, you've got the Red Sea and the Houthis attacking ships, which is impacting trade. We've got the war in Ukraine, which is going on 2 years. Volodymyr Zelensky is here. He'll be addressing folks at Davos. In Africa, there's the coups. What's your take on that economic impact there?
No, thank you for highlighting that very important problem. So if you look at the Global Terrorism Index from this year, in 2022, 43% of terrorism-related deaths were in the Sahel region.
Wow.
And since 2020, there have been 11 coups or attempted coups in the continent. So governance is one of the triggers. Obviously, climate-induced shocks is another issue. But I think the biggest challenge has been the economy and this fast-growing youth population. So as I mentioned, between now and 2050, 50% of the population global growth will be in Africa, and 90% of the workforce growth will be in Africa. So all these young people, the rest of young population, if they aren't jobs to meet their expectations, these types of issues, it could contribute to social fragility. So no, it is a big concern. And I think that's why focusing on the youthful dynamism of the continent and ensuring that we're creating jobs, with the AFCFTA and other different instruments is quite critical.
Rounding up, for Chido, what's your response to people who say Davos is just a collection of rich people who flying with their private jets to discuss things? Can you talk about its impact and what Davos means to the rest of the world?
Yeah, so beyond obviously, our business constituents who are very important, we have governments here. The Vice President of Nigeria is here with the Finance Minister, the Minister of Oil, etc. But we also have a youth contingent of global shapers, so those between the ages of 20 and 30, who we also invite to participate, young global leaders, social innovators and entrepreneurs. So it's a diverse pool. I think the impact is ensuring that from the Africa perspective, that Africa is part of these important dialogues that are going to shape economies and outcomes in the future, whether it's some of what we're seeing with emerging technologies related to artificial intelligence. This, of course, is going to drastically shape societies and economies. And if we're not here as part of those conversations, Sam Altman is here, the CEO of Google, Satya Nadella is here. If we're not part of those conversations, we won't be able to ensure that Africa's perspective and needs are met within these technologies.
And Sam Altman just got married in Hawaii right before coming out to Davos. Final question: what's your outlook for 2024 for the African continent? Are you cautiously optimistic, or how are you seeing things?
I'm certainly cautiously optimistic. I don't think we'll see the levels of inflation that we saw last year. We'll certainly see recovery in many of the important economies, and I think it's going to continue to be a pretty difficult sort of fiscal environment for most governments. Most governments are going to continue to spend a lot of their budgets financing debt. But I think there is some positive horizons, as I mentioned, the AFCFTA and many different things that could help boost the economy. A fast-growing large workforce that can increase productivity. But yes, certainly a lot of caution ahead.
Chido Munyati, head of Africa at the World Economic Forum, thank you so much for speaking to Arise News. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.